I guess. But
Okay, I'm going to start and introduce you, Oliver, and we'll let people come in. And we are recording this, so you can go back and watch this anytime. My name is Leah. I work at Teton County Library, and you have joined the second installment of our Let's Talk About Death series. And tonight we have Oliver Goss talking about coping with grief and hospice services. And a little bit about Oliver. He has been working as a hospice social worker for over 10 years and has come to understand how the death and dying process affects people and their families. His work over the years has included work with at-risk adolescents, children, families, and couples in schools, mental health agencies, and private practice settings. He has practiced as a licensed clinical social worker since 2003. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Oliver.
Well, thank you very much, Leah. So I'd like to, welcome you all. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully what I present tonight will be valuable for you and good information. The title of my presentation is Facing Mortality, Hospice Services, and Coping with Grief. So tonight I'm going to be describing the scope of what hospice services are and a little bit about the background of hospice, and then to talk a little bit about just things that are very common for people to experience with grief. So that's going to be the basic layout of tonight. If you end up having any interest in sort of asking any questions, feel free to do so. I'm not opposed to kind of being interrupted, and if you want to wait, there will be a couple moments where we'll be able to sort of pause and take questions. During the course of my life, there's really only two universal truths that I've come across that fit all human beings. And that's that we were born and that we die. And those are the only universal truths that I've ever found that are kind of across the spectrum of culture and where we come from and everything. So it's just kind of interesting as we kind of stepped into the modern era, though, we've really have a tendency to shy away from conversations about death. It seems that we've kind of lost touch with the kind of reality that we're mortal in these modern times. And I've always kind of wondered sort of why that is. Why do many of us get very uncomfortable when or don't know what to say or things like that when faced with conversations about death or talking to somebody who is grieving. It's just really, I think it's definitely become a very modern, it's become more heightened in the modern era. And I mean, the simple answer is really, talking about death and dying is not an easy subject to talk about. And the reason why it's not easy is because there's so many unknowns. I mean, we all have we may have our different faith and belief systems that kind of tell us what's going to happen, but it's a belief, it's a faith. It's not something we can point to that's really clear. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about both hospice and grief. What I'll do now is kind of shift into talking a little bit about just hospice services in general. And it's really interesting to me is, having worked in hospice for 10 years, I've found that a lot of people have a lot of misunderstandings about what hospice services really are. If, you say the word hospice, like when I introduced myself as a hospice social worker at a party, you get this, oh, kind of response. Like, I mean, people really think of, this, that just, being around people who are dying all the time. And it's a lot more than that. It's a lot more than just the kind of the last moments of someone's life. Really, it's really kind of focused on supporting a person who has a terminal illness and their entire family so that they can be comfortable in their last months and have the highest quality of life that's possible for them. So it's really focused on that. And one of the interesting things about hospice is, if you think about it, it's a very, very ancient concept. I mean, it's been around since human beings started spending time together as a group. I mean, people have been taking care of, their clan members in their illnesses for eons, right? But the sort of idea of hospice as a place where people are taken care of is sort of really the first sort of hospices were really sort of thought to come up, or were developed around the year 1065, originally in and around Malta, as people were migrating to the Holy City en route to kind of like going to the Holy Land, where people were the idea was that people have been, the idea is that they were caring for people who are sick or ill or weary. And that's sort of the kind of where it first began. The first modern hospice really started in about 1967 by this woman, Cicely Saunders, in South London. And a few years after that, the Yale School of Nursing Dean Florence Wald started a hospice in the U.S., and that was in 1971. So if you think of like hospice as a service that's been provided, it's an ancient service. However, the modern concept of it is quite new. It's maybe 50 years old, 60 years old as an idea. It's just within the last 50 or 60 years that we've had this, and then sort of more recently, I think in the last maybe 20 years, the sort of palliative medicine has sort of come to the forefront. And palliative medicine is often used by hospices, but it's a separate thing. Palliative medicine is really the kinds of treatment, the kinds of medications that help treat people's symptoms from various illnesses. So it can be used in non-hospice situations. For instance, if someone's getting a chemotherapy treatment, oftentimes palliative medicine will be used to kind of deal with the side effects of the chemotherapy. But palliative medicine is used in most cases in hospice care, because sometimes when we're getting closer to the end of our lives, we have symptoms that are really uncomfortable. And so that's where the palliative medicine really kind of treats the symptoms, but it's not for curative purposes, because in hospice, it's sort of the idea is that you're focused on maintaining the quality of life that you have left, but not pursuing treatment. So what does hospice service look like now? It's a support service for a person who has a terminal illness, and it's for their whole family. And so it's not just for someone who's ill, but it covers the entire family. And it's pretty specific in terms of how people can qualify for hospice, where it's through the sort of Medicare regulations, where someone's been determined to have a diagnosis that is a terminal illness. And also on top of that, there's an estimate that the person has about 6 months or less to live. And they've decided to forego any other treatments. So that's how someone qualifies. And obviously, the 6 months ideas, it's just a guess, right? We can never predict how long someone's going to live. That's just impossible. In terms of what kind of service it is, there are, in some larger communities, they have hospice houses, which actually provide the nursing care 24/7 for hospice patients who actually move into the hospice house, and then their family can come visit them as much as they want. Here in Jackson, in the smaller community, we don't have that available to us yet. I know that the Sage Living facility will have a pod that'll be specifically for hospice care, which I'm pretty excited about in terms of taking sort of that day-to-day direct care responsibilities and sort of relieving the family members of that. But it's not a 24/7, in terms of our care right now here in Jackson, we don't have a 24/7 care service that's in the home. But it does have nursing care to assist the family and the patient in terms of managing the symptoms that they're experiencing, whether it be pain or nausea or water retention or things like that. You can also have access to physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, certified nurses assistants who can kind of help with daily living, activities of daily living like showering, bathing, getting dressed if someone gets to the point where that's really difficult. And then there's also the hospice social workers who are there to provide the sort of psychological and psychosocial support for families and people who are dealing with their illness themselves, as well as a chaplain who is on service who can provide the spiritual care. We do have a whole pool of volunteers that can help in a variety of things. However, due to COVID now, those volunteers are all on hold until we kind of get through this pandemic for obvious reasons, and trying to make sure we keep our patients and their families safe as well as the volunteers safe. So it really kind of is multi-tiered in terms of how it supports people. It supports them medically, it supports them, spiritually, psychosocially, it just all these different things. We can bring in equipment, help families get connected to various resources. For instance, if they need assistance with the care at home, we can help get them connected to private care resources. And the hospice service itself is all covered through Medicare. And most private insurances, excuse me, cover the hospice services as well. So it's like people don't get a big bill at the end of it, right? And obviously it's for people when they've decided that they don't want to pursue treatment anymore. I mean, everybody has their different place where they get to where they're like, I'm no longer interested in trying to cure this disease. Or maybe you get to a place where there is no possible cure. I mean, our modern medicine is limited in that regard. We can't cure everything. It was really interesting. There's the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization did a survey back in 2018, and they found that almost 30% of all the hospice patients in the U.S. Were on services for less than 1 week. So they came on at the very last week of their life, and then another 40% were on for less than 14 days. This has really kind of been sort of interesting for me in terms of anecdotally what I've observed over the years working with hospice patients is that when patients and families have had, a couple of months, 2, 3, 4 months of time working with the hospice team, they are able to develop this sort of much more comfortable relationship with the team. And when a patient gets to the point where they're really vulnerable, as they get really close to the end of their life, it's a much more supportive service. So it's something to keep in mind, that, what I've noticed is that the service just seems to be a much more impactful, supportive service when families, folks and families are on the service for at least a couple months. If you think of it like if you're in the last week of your life and it's like you get hospice and all these people come into your house who you don't know, and it's like it can be pretty overwhelming, versus if you've kind of had this time to kind of get to know them, it makes it a lot smoother. And then another part about hospice services that a lot of people don't understand or don't know about is that after someone in our care dies, the bereavement services are available to family members for up to 13 months, and that's free of charge. That's included in the hospice benefit. And that can be, like I do a whole slew of different kinds of bereavement support. I've done bereavement support for whole families. I've done bereavement support for individuals. I do bereavement groups, because that sort of transition to getting used to life without somebody who's been really important to you and pivotal for you throughout your experience. It's a hard transition to make oftentimes, and so that bereavement support is available. So in terms of like just hospice as a summation, really, it's about allowing for people to have a natural death and to support them within their homes as best we can, and to make them comfortable and to really kind of promote their quality of life. That's a huge part of hospice. Let me just sort of share a quick story about that. Kind of because in hospice, we can be so creative in terms of how we provide support for folks, that there was a hospice patient a number of years ago that I worked with, and the family really wanted to, take a sort of a last sort of road trip together to one of the coasts. They didn't want to have to, they wanted to make sure they could access the support while they're on the road. So we were able to make sure they had all the medicine they needed for dealing with the symptoms, all the supplies and equipment they might have needed on the road, and also documentation. So if they needed to go to an emergency room because the symptoms were getting too difficult or too challenging, they would have documentation showing that they were on hospice. And so when they say, hey, listen, I just want the symptoms to be controlled, I don't want to have any life-sustaining treatment, it's really clear for the emergency room. So this family was able to go to the coast, have a very, very powerful, meaningful experience together. It was really amazing that for us as an organization to be able to help support them and allow them, help them do that. So that's one of the cool things about hospice is we've got a lot of flexibility in terms of how we do it. I'm going to pause here just for a second because we're going to change gears in a second and go into talking about grief. But if anybody has any questions or comments you want to put in the chat or anything, this would be a good time if you want to unmute or ask any questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions. So I'll just give a few, little bit of time for people to ask questions.
I'll start with a question. So do you have to qualify for hospice, or can I be like, I decide my loved one needs to be in hospice, or who decides?
Yeah, so you do need to have a doctor sign off that you have a terminal illness, and the expectation is that you have 6 months or less to live, and that's a guesstimate, right? So I've worked with hospice patients who've been on services for a year and a half. And one of the cool things about hospice too is that if you go on hospice and you start getting better for some reason, which does happen, you can go off hospice. Interesting enough, like my grandmother, she was on hospice 3 different times before she actually before she actually died. So she was able to kind of like, with the support of hospice, just sort of get a little better and stable, and decided she didn't need that support anymore and went off. And so that happened 3 times. So that's another part about hospice too, that I think people get scared about, is they think, well, if I sign up for hospice, that means it's over, right? Yeah. But, you could be on hospice and you hear about a new, experimental treatment that you want to try. You could be like, well, I'm going to stop doing hospice and go for this treatment. That's completely reasonable and no problem at all to do. Did that answer your question? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have another question, if nobody else has a question.
Okay.
So my grandfather, and this is to your thing about how creative you can be in hospice, and the goal is to keep them comfortable and stuff. Who gets to decide what comfort is? And like an example was my grandfather was in hospice care in a facility, and they kept pureeing all of his foods. Like the spaghetti was pureed and the salad was pureed, and he was fresh. He just wanted whole food to eat, right? So like, does he get to decide that because that's what is enjoyable to him, or there's a safety or, like who gets to dictate if your food's pureed or not?
Well, I think if someone's at their home and we're coming into their home, we're just a support for them at home.
Mhm.
So that would be their decision. I mean, I think one of the things that we would do is educate people. If someone's, if their condition has a high risk of them choking on food, if it's not pureed, we would educate people about that. But their decision it's their decision about what they want to do,
Okay.
because we want to support that, right? If someone's in a facility and getting hospice services, then you might end up having to kind of really follow the guidelines of that facility. And I know there is a fair amount of diversity in terms of how different facilities approach it. We work very closely with the Living Center, and we will be working closely with the Sage Living when it's finished. And they're phenomenal in terms of providing the support for folks. And we're there as when we work with hospice patients in the Living Center, it's more of we're there as a consultation, to help guide the care, to make sure that we're focusing on comfort and focusing on quality.
Okay.
So.
Thanks.
Okay.
Anyone else? You can also put it in the chat if you're shy and don't want to ask, and I'll read it too.
Yeah. Well, what I'll do is I'll go on and talk about grief a little bit now, and then if you have any, if you can still throw something in the chat if you'd like. So in talking about grief, I mean, one of the things about grief is well, let's define it first, really. In terms of the dictionary definition of grief, it's a deep and poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement, right? So it's caused by loss. We can grieve the loss of someone who's really important to us, who's died. We can grieve the loss of independence if we get to the point where we're not able to ambulate on our own, walk around on our own, for instance. We can grieve the fact that coming up this holiday season is going to be really different because we really can't gather with our whole families, that everyone can't come from all over the place. Or if they do, it's really risky, right? So grief can be a number of things, but in terms of it's a very emotional, it's the emotional response to loss, right? And I think oftentimes people when they think about grief as it relates to death, is that people think about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, the book she wrote on death and dying, and her stages of grief that she identified. And that's often what people think about, is you have these stages of grief that you go through. And I really want to caution you to think by thinking about grief that way, because one, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work was really written, was really done, for the person who is experiencing a terminal illness and is getting closer to dying themselves. So it doesn't really translate to the people who are left. However, it does have really helpful concepts. But it's also not like this, you go through this stage and next stage and you check this box and you go to the next one. It's much more fluid and complicated than that. But there are a lot of things that come from her work, that sort of this sort of experience of denial that this isn't real, that this isn't happening or didn't happen. Experiences of anger where people feel really irritable or snappy. People experiencing, sort of sadness and depression, and then kind of sort of working eventually towards this place of acceptance where it's like we've come to sort of terms with this is the new reality. So those concepts are really helpful to think, because I think people do sort of bounce around between those things, but it's not a linear process. It's not like you go from one stage to the next. Since you're also not going from one stage to the next, oftentimes it can be sort of a whole experienced as a whole slew of contradictory emotions that come up in waves. And I've heard people describe to me that they're like tsunamis or tidal waves of emotion. And they kind of hit when oftentimes when you least expect it. But it's weird, we could be telling a really funny story about our loved one and laughing, and then 30 seconds later just be bawling our eyes out. Or, it's like there's a lot of contradictory emotions, and they're strong emotions. They're very powerful. And the intensity is really often based on kind of the nature of the relationship we had with the person who died. Like if you think of it in your life, you may have known some people who've died here and there, but didn't know them well. And you might feel a certain level of sadness, but it doesn't really stick with us. And I think when a lot of times when I'm talking with people, it's the surprising element of like, this person was really important to me who died. And this grief is unlike any grief I've ever experienced before, because, it's that person was much more central to their life. And so it becomes a lot more intense. I think the areas where I've seen people really kind of be surprised by this sort of level of grief is when it's either a spouse, or it's a parent, or it's a sibling, or a child, or a best friend that you've been sort of inseparable. So it's like that intensity of the relationship kind of creates the intensity of the grief experience. And another part of it is like, we go through our lives just being pretty removed from grief experiences. We don't often experience it. Like I think, most people don't have a grief experience until they're into adulthood. There are some kids who do, and that's a kind of a whole different level of complication, but a lot of people don't, right? I like to also think about grief as this sort of process, right? It's not like there's no sort of time frame for grief, but it's a process. And I came across this really nice sort of way to describe what the process is. And the idea of it is really it's a reconstruction of meaning. It's a process of reconstruction of meaning. Because like if you think of it, our relationships with people important to us in our lives, those relationships take up a certain amount of meaning in our life. And when someone really important to us dies, that part of the meaning of our life is actually no longer accessible. I mean, we can access it through stories, through memories, through shared sort of that sharing of the narratives, but we can't sit down with them and have a conversation or have a cup of coffee with them. That's no longer possible. And so that leaves a bit of a vacancy for us as human beings in terms of the meaning of our life. That the process of grief is to then sort of rebuild, reconstruct sort of a new sense of meaning that can fill in some of that space. And obviously we don't want to fill in all that space because we don't want to completely forget that person. In fact, grief is, the process is also really getting to a point where we can remember without much pain. I want to kind of talk a little bit. There's a gentleman I worked with a number of years ago, where it was shortly after I sort of learned about this reconstruction of meaning sort of concept, and I was started working with this guy, and his wife had died, and he came to me about 3 years after she died, and he was still really struggling with it. And he just felt like something's wrong with him. And over the course of my work with him, I started kind of, just trying to understand what he was experiencing. And I remember at one point I asked him, well, so if you could sort of, give us sort of a percentage of how much of the meaning of your life was tied into the relationship with your wife, like what would you say? And it was like without a drop in the hat, he was just right off the bat, just 90%. And I was like, oh my gosh, 90% of the meaning of this gentleman's life was no longer accessible. And so it really helped me understand the significance of that loss for him and why 3 years later, it was still very, very difficult for him. And this is something I think we forget about as people, just people who are not really thinking about grief much, is we forget about the fact that someone may be dealing with grief from 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years ago that's still uncomfortable. Maybe I'd like to kind of talk a little bit now about just some common responses that people have to grief, right? We talked a little bit about that sort of denial phase from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, and that where it's sort of the shock, this numbness, this disbelief, and I really want to kind of state how I've come to understand that as really a protective aspect of grief, where the sort of like people will reach for their phones and start dialing and calling their loved one and then be like, I can't, or they'll come around a corner expecting to see their loved one, or they'll get home at night, walk in the front door expecting to see their loved one. And it's like, it's kind of a shock. And yet this I've come to understand is really protective, because if you think about it, if we could absorb the entirety of what the loss of someone important to us means in our life, if we could absorb that all at once, I strongly believe we would just fracture psychologically. Like, we just could not handle that. There's so many aspects of how people touch our lives that we need this sort of like this protective sort of like ability to crack open the door and shut it close again. So that's a really common experience people have. And then another common thing is just people have these sort of weird contradictory emotions, like feeling really intense anger at God, anger at their loved one, anger at themselves for not, I shoulda, coulda, woulda. The guilt can sort of come in as well. Irritability, guilt and regret and anger and irritability, they all can kind of be mingling at the same time, which is just very uncomfortable. And then on top of that, people can experience, a sense of relief, especially if they've been taking care of somebody for a long time who's had a long illness where they've gradually declined, where the sense of relief, and then people feel like, I'm glad they're not suffering, but I feel relief, and now I feel guilty for feeling relief, and angry because I'm feeling, it gets really complicated where they start these emotions start circling around. People can experience quite, some pretty intense loneliness. They can experience sort of anxiety and sort of a panic, right? Like C.S. Lewis wrote, he was quoted, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." People can have these sort of like almost panicking feelings. They'll be in the grocery store and something on the grocery shelf will trigger them, and they'll be like, I got to leave, right? I got to leave the grocery store. So they just run out of the grocery store. People can experience a lot of sadness. And then also people can experience significant amounts of confusion or disorientation. Like our sort of organizational capacity can be really hampered. Like, we just forget, like, where did I put my keys? I don't even know where they are. I mean, I know I always usually put them there, but I didn't put them there. Where, people can't keep track of things. People like read a book, read a paragraph, read it like 20 times and still don't know what it says. And then, like, if people are having a hard time concentrating with their and being able to kind of retain information, that can really affect work situations as well. So you kind of got to think about, well, what do we do with all these feelings? Because these feelings, they happen. We don't have a choice of which ones we experience when we're grieving, but they do come up. So you got to think about, like, well, how do you do it? And so you think about, I like this, an acronym, AID, really. So AID is like, A is just accept what you're feeling, right? There's no right or wrong feelings about grief. It's just, you have to kind of be able to accept that whatever the uncomfortable or comfortable feelings are, that's what you're having, and they're part of grief. And so, you can also pay attention to, like, if you start feeling tension in your shoulders or kind of a tightness in your chest, or like or, knot in your stomach or something. That these could be cues that like you might be experiencing some pretty intense emotions. And then the next is really the I for aid, is really identify your feelings, really trying to specifically, which feelings are you experiencing? And I think what happens is usually when we can identify and name the feeling we're experiencing or the feelings that we're experiencing, it helps us better able to deal with them and kind of be able to figure, okay, is it, if I'm feeling really irritable now, what do I need to do? Okay, I'm feeling irritable now. What do I need to do? Maybe I need to go for a walk or something. And then the D in the aid is really doing something with those feelings. Obviously crying. I know I've talked with a lot of tough old Wyoming guys who don't think that crying is okay, but they do cry, and it's a real release. Talking to someone who can listen without judging what you're experiencing, because we don't want to have that judgment piece. That's really important. You can use art, markers, paint, crayons, to kind of express your feelings on paper, just by scribbling or doodling, or you can rip up magazines or old phone books, rip up newspaper. It's a very kind of cathartic experience of just physically getting emotion by ripping out of your body by ripping paper. We can walk, run, physical activity, go find a good place to have a good yell or scream into a pillow, right? So these are all kind of different things we can do with our feelings. And it's really important to think about that, because the waves of grief that are going to hit, and they're going to hit at random times. Sometimes we'll be able to anticipate them and sometimes we won't, but they do hit. And so we need to be able to think about, well, what do we do when that happens? Another part of grief I think is really helpful to think about is really thinking of like your whole person, right? Like how you take care of yourself physically through exercise and how you're eating, being careful of how much consumption of alcohol or other substances you might be doing, because those just will complicate the emotional process. I know that alcohol sometimes helps us feel better for a little while, but what it does is it just kicks the can of the emotional experience down the road. It doesn't help us address it. It just kind of delays it for a little while. And it can also complicate things because, we don't make the best decisions when we are inebriated. And then the other part is really, just emotional release. Like, how do you deal with the emotions that you experience? We need to have those releases of emotion, because if you just try to stuff them, they will come out sideways. They will catch up with you. Helping sort of your intellect, trying to, have maybe, a little reading some for self-insight, or just kind of thinking about, different ways, just exposing yourself to different information that might be helpful, just to kind of broaden your mind. And then also really being careful about making hasty decisions or big decisions, because we don't, when we're stressed with grief, we just don't make very good decisions oftentimes that we might regret later. Accessing social support or putting boundaries around social support. Sometimes that social support is really uncomfortable and you just need time to yourself. And kind of reflecting on, like, what do you need, in terms of spiritual, for your own spirituality, whether it be attending church, talking to a pastor or a minister, or going out in the woods, or, meditating or practicing yoga. There's lots of different ways we tap into our own spirituality. So those are really kind of important things to keep in mind about grieving. There's a couple of things I want to kind of touch on before I finish up today, just about some of the complicating things that happen with grief. And one of those is sort of what's kind of called anniversary experiences, where throughout the course of a year, there are certain times of the year that people find themselves being much more sensitive, emotionally sensitive. And it's based on that there's something about that time of year that was really important to them and the person who died and their relationship with that person. Oftentimes it can be birthdays or holidays, but it doesn't just have to be that, right? There was a woman I worked with probably about 5 or 10 years ago, somewhere in that range. And her husband died, and he died in the fall. I spent a lot of time sort of supporting her through the bereavement work throughout the winter. And, by the sort of late winter, she was feeling pretty good. Like she was like, not great, but she was feeling kind of much more grounded. And then like a little later in the spring, I got a call from her, and she was just crying and crying and crying. And she says, I've been crying for 5 hours and I can't stop. I don't know why I'm crying. I think I'm going crazy. Like she really thought she needed to go check herself into a mental institution. And so I started talking to her and trying to ask her a bunch of questions about what she was experiencing. And, it was like, what were you doing when this sort of started? And she was like, well, I was out in the garden digging up the flowers. And I was like, well, was there anything about gardening that's been really important for you and your husband? And she was like, well, yeah, my husband and I, we would garden every spring together and watch the flowers come up. And it's like, it was this aha moment for her where she was able to identify all this emotional turmoil there was a reason for it, and it was related to her grief and this anniversary experience. And I remember at the end of the conversation, she was still a little teary and sniffly, but at the end of the conversation, she was like, so I'm not crazy. And I was like, no, you're not. This is a normal grief experience. You just needed some help identifying that's what it was. So those anniversary times can often catch people off guard significantly. And so I think one of the first things I like to ask people is, if you're having that really sensitive time, right, you're feeling a lot of that sensitivity, is there something about this time of year that's important to you and the relationship you had with the person who died, right? Another aspect about grief that it gets complicated is that it's sort of multi-layered, right? Fundamentally, grief is very much an individual experience. We all could know, have a very close relationship with one person who dies, and each one of us will have a different experience in our grief. We'll have some similarities, but there'll be lots of differences too. And so on the fundamental level, it's very much an individual experience. Yet on top of that, there's this sort of communal sort of expectations about grief, right? Like the community that we're members of, there's some expectations, whether it be our family expectations or maybe our church community expectations. Like those expectations and like what's grief supposed to look like, how you do it, those may or may not kind of sort of mirror our own individual experiences. When they mirror it, it's really wonderful. When they don't, it's really uncomfortable. And then on top of that, you have the individual, you have the communal, and then you have the cultural expectations, which may or may not align up with our individual experiences. It's really interesting. I talked to, so part of my hospice experience was working down actually in Star Valley. And I remember a couple different, these two different women who I talked with, where they both were of the LDS faith. And I just was really struck by how one of them's experience of her faith and her faith community was extremely comforting, and it was so wonderful, right? And the other one's experience of her community of faith was really uncomfortable. And it was just like they both had strong faith, and yet they had different experiences of it. And these are two completely separate bereavement instances, but it just goes to show that like the communal and cultural levels may or may not align with our own individual experience, and that's okay. It's just, it makes it much more complicated. Another thing that really complicates how we experience grief is just, how someone dies. I mean, it really changes that grief experience. If it's a sudden, unexpected death, there's no preparation time. So all our grieving is spent like we start from scratch. When it's more of a prolonged sort of death where someone kind of slowly declines over time, we kind of go through this anticipatory grieving, right? So grieving in anticipation, and it can help sort of prepare us, but it really doesn't totally prepare us. It's still really hard. So like those are just two really different ways people experience grief, depending on how somebody dies. And then if there are other things like death by suicide or by drug overdose, those have their own sort of, they're almost taboo subjects. So people can feel extremely isolated because they don't know if they can talk to people around them about, the really sensitive nature of someone they know died, who was close to them died by suicide or by drug overdose. So those can really complicate people's experiences of grief because you can run across a lot of judgment that's being thrown on you about the person you really cared about. Another part of grief that really can get complicated is it can trigger old trauma. I'll tell you a story to kind of explain this a little bit. What I mean by this is, so there was a woman I met with a number of years ago who her husband had Alzheimer's, and he was declining, and he got to the point where he needed to have a hospital bed, and he couldn't really get out of a hospital bed. So we brought a hospital bed into their living room, so he could be. It was just much easier for him in terms of being cared for, turned and cleaned up and stuff, because he couldn't get up on his own at all. And so she started sleeping out in the living room with him. And she was sleeping out in the living room in front of the sliding glass doors, which she then kind of that triggered an old trauma from her from when she was in her early teens about there was a guy who was stalking her, and her bedroom had a sliding glass door in it. And so just sleeping in front of that sliding glass door triggered all this trauma. So this woman was experiencing anticipatory grief. And on top of that, all this trauma that was just like she was having nightmares. She was having just recurring intrusive thoughts. And so, what it really complicated her anticipatory grief process profoundly. So what I ended up doing is I ended up working with her doing some what's called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's this really cool therapy that is specific for trauma. It looks really weird, but what it does is it allows people's brains to reprocess the trauma and file it into memory. And so she wouldn't have ever experienced this re-experiencing of this trauma had it not been for this sort of anticipatory grieving situation and her husband getting close to death. I've also talked to other people where they've had trauma experiences come up after someone has died, where, so it can happen where it brings up old trauma. Grief is really a profoundly stressful experience. It's an emotional, stressful experience. And if you think about stress, emotional stress, like we can handle a certain amount of it, right? But after a certain point, we kind of start going down the fight, flight, or freeze continuum. If you're familiar with that, it's a survival mechanism that our brain has that at a certain point, Abigail, it's very weird, but people have lots of amazing results from the EMDR. Yeah, totally. It is really weird, but it's super cool. So the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? It's a defense mechanism for us. And emotional stress can start triggering that. And grief is profoundly emotional, right? It's like there's a woman I worked with where she was in the post office trying to work out some issue with her post box with the postal service worker, and just the communication was just breaking down. It wasn't working, and she was getting flustered, and the postal service person was getting flustered, and you know, in normal times she would have been able to work through it and kind of deal with it. But since she was dealing with grief, like she reached this point where she was like, if she told me if I had stayed even 3 seconds longer, I probably would have ended up in jail, because I probably would have jumped the counter and just tried to pummel the postal service worker, right? So it's like our ability to kind of manage stress is compromised, right? Because, you know, usually we're at this sort of, here's our sort of threshold for stress. Like we're way down here. We can handle all this stress. And then we start grieving and we're up here. Our stress level's up here because of grief. So we only have this amount of like reserve energy to handle stress. And so we just, it really can complicate things that way. Another part that really affects, you know, that people experience with grief is having to kind of deal with changing roles. There's another woman I worked with where her husband died, and they were together for like 30 years or something. And they had sort of very clear delineated things they each did. And he was a guy who mowed the lawn, fixed the pipes, winterized their place, you know, and she really kind of took, you know, more of a traditional sort of idea where she took care of the house, the interior of the house. And after he died, she had to relearn how to mow the lawn, how to start the mower, where to go to kind of shut off the pipes for the watering system so that it doesn't freeze in the winter. Like she had to relearn how to do all this stuff. And she knew how to do this stuff before she got married, but after 30 years of not doing it, she had to kind of whoa, like, and that was really challenging for her. And it just added to the stress of grief. So the last thing I want to touch on really is how other people kind of respond to us when we're grieving. And there's sort of like what our social supports end up looking like. So I found there's a number of they suck. Yeah. There's an interesting thing about grief, right? That there are people who show up, who provide the kind of support that is super helpful, that is really comforting. And if you have those people in your life and you're grieving, make sure you're kind of making sure they're number one people to kind of you know, tap into. And Abigail, I see you wrote, not the people you think you will, right? That's the other thing. There are the people you think will show up who either show up and provide really uncomfortable support, so really the antithesis of support, and the people who show up, and then there's the people who you think will show up who just never show up, right? For the people who show up and provide that really uncomfortable kind of interaction, I think it's really important to think about trying to set some boundaries with them about, listen, I know you're trying to be helpful, but this is not helpful right now. And know that at this point in time, their support is not going to help. It's not going to be comforting. And that's okay. And for the people who don't show up, who you'd like to show up, you know, you might get to a point where you have to kind of extend the invitation. The two people, the people who show up and provide that really uncomfortable support, or the people who don't show up at all, what I've found is that tends to be because people don't understand what is needed for grief. And so either they show up and they think, this is what I got to do to help support you, without asking, right? Maybe they say something like, oh, I'm sorry for your loss, which I think most of the people I've ever talked to who have been grieving say that it's just a slap in the face. I have had one person that I remember saying that it was really helpful to hear that. So it's not completely useless, but like how we say things, like we have all these sort of hallmark kind of statements, you know, where we have these hallmark kind of statements where this is what we're supposed to say, but there's no thought into like, is that actually really helpful, right? And then the people who don't show up at all, I think that same sort of thing. They just don't know what to say. So rather than try anything, they just think, oh, I just will give them space. I won't do anything. And then obviously people get kind of sucked into their own worlds and they kind of get busy, and then they kind of can often forget. And it's really hard though. So I think really thinking about those people that show up, that really provides that support. Those are the people you want to surround yourself with. And the other people might take time before you can let them back in, right? So I know we're just got a couple more minutes tonight, and if you have any further questions or comments, I know Abigail, you wrote something about losing your keys. I'm not quite sure what you were meaning by that, but I suspect it's that sort of just not being able to kind of keep track of sort of regular cognitive thinking. Oh, when people say sorry for your loss, yeah, it's like it's like losing your keys. Yeah. It's like, oh, sorry you lost your keys. Yeah, no, it feels pretty disingenuous for most people. So if there are any other further comments or questions, I'd be happy to, hear you out. And I hope this was valuable for you and helpful. So,
Yeah, that was great. So if anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask it directly to Oliver. That would be great too. Otherwise, I can ask a question while you're thinking about asking a question. So, yeah, John or Jay.
Yeah, Oliver, what about helping people that are in the process of dying with their grief? Because
you mean
they have a lot of regrets about their life sometimes, or there were things that happened in the relationship that they are grieving about with the other person.
Yeah, and I think, let me try to answer that for you, Jay, and see if that it makes sense to you. And if I don't answer it, please kind of clarify for me. But I think what it is it really comes down to really trying to, acknowledge the complicated and contradictory feelings that people experience, and be okay with that, and be okay with expressing the feelings that the other person has, that you have, that because we do need to acknowledge those feelings. And then what we can do is, if we can kind of acknowledge because usually in those kind of circumstances, it's in it kind of hurt that was caused, but not on purpose. It was not intentional. It was unintentional harm. And so really trying to redress those regrets. I mean, we all are going to have regrets, right? We don't get through life doing everything perfectly. That's absolutely impossible. So we're going to experience regrets. People that we really love are going to experience regrets. And so acknowledging what those regrets are, really trying to just sit with the feelings and being okay with those feelings. Because I think there's a process, especially when someone is going through the process of dying themselves, where they have to kind of revisit some of those regrets, to be able to kind of find a place to be at peace with them. And the family members around who are witnessing that, or the friends, when they kind of sit and listen and hear, without judgment, that you can kind of like begin to resolve some of those regrets. And the same goes with family members. Maybe family members are experiencing a significant amount of regret because, like one thing I found, like especially with young kids, is you'll see this sort of play out with young kids where they'll be thinking, well, if only I'd cleaned my room that day, my mom or dad wouldn't have died. Right. And it's completely completely based on just emotion. And yet that they do need to kind of process that. So I think it's really trying to open up space to be able to have time to kind of sort of be okay with the different emotions that come up. I don't know, Jay, if that didn't answer your question, please clarify for me, but I hope it did.
And you were saying that we only have like a certain level that we have to deal with stress and grief. But what about when something is like an ongoing thing like this pandemic? Like, how are we to cope with something that has no end in sight, and the changes? We get used to wearing masks or whatever, but you don't know when there will be ever to fill the void of the loss of what going to the movies or hanging out with our friends or whatever.
Yeah.
How do we deal with ongoing?
Well, and I think that it's interesting because when we're grieving the death of someone important to us, that sort of end point, oftentimes you can't see it. Like, I mean, it's way down there. So I think we just get back to that kind of acknowledging identifying what the feelings are, acknowledging what it is, and being able to kind of what's the stuff that we do to take care of ourselves to deal with that stress, right? And I'm glad you reminded me about COVID, because COVID has really complicated the grief process significantly, right? I mean, before COVID, when someone, died, there'd be this big gathering of lots of people, lots of storytelling, lots of tears, lots of hugs. And now that's really risky, right? So most people aren't. There's a woman I was talking with recently who was just like, I'm a hugger and I haven't been able to hug anybody. And it's just crushing me, right? And so like COVID has definitely affected how people experience grief. I see there's a comment here. People need to be able to tolerate and sit with both their own and others' discomfort. That is why Americans are bad at this stuff. Americans like to put a positive spin on everything and tie it up with a bow. Our death, others' death, pandemic too. Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, I mean, the kind of pretending that we're not mortal has really negatively affected our ability to sit with the uncomfortable feelings that come up with grief and loss. So really trying to kind of be tolerant of that and understand that the contradictory nature of the emotions we experience in grief, that's what grief is. It's not this, okay, it's been 2 months, you're good. I mean, like, it could be anything. It could be any kind of sensory input that can send us in a tailspin with grief. Taste, touch, sight, sound, smell. I've heard people talk about they'll walking along and they'll smell the smell of that cooking that their loved one did all the time, and just be like, snotty tears walking past a restaurant, right away. Or they'll be listening to the radio, driving along, and that song will come on and they have to pull over and just like bawl for 20, 30 minutes, right? So it's not a finite experience. And so I think the more people can understand that, the more we can be compassionate towards those people around us who are grieving, and compassionate to ourselves when we're dealing with our own grief. And I really think that compassion can go a long way in helping just move through the grief process. Because it's all
Other question that was in the chat.
Okay.
From Paul: will hospice assist someone who wants to commit suicide?
Hospice will not do assisted suicide. And why in the state of Wyoming that's not legal right now. Who knows, that might change. I know in the state of Oregon that assisted suicide is legal. I know if you're not a resident there, there's a whole process you have to go through in order to become eligible there. But what I know hospice does have the ability to do is what's called, I just forgot the word, palliative sedation. Like if someone's symptomology has gotten to be this point where they're so uncomfortable, they just want to crank up all the drugs and just let me just be sedated until I die naturally. So that is something that can be available to people. And I think that's just a conversation that we'd have to have with your doc, the hospice doc. I mean, so we want to be really thoughtful about that. But that we don't do sort of assisted suicide. It's not legal here in Wyoming. And I don't know if it'll ever be legal in Wyoming, given the conservative nature of a lot of the rest of the state. So.
Any other last questions? I don't see any put in the chat. Unmute yourself. Is there a way that people could reach you if they have other questions that they thought of afterwards, or?
Yeah, certainly. Here, I'll type in my contact information. Oh, whoops. My email. Oops.
And then we'll also repost this video on the library website. So if you wanted to go back and watch anything, you will be able to do that. Otherwise, join us for the last part of the series on December 3rd. It's a Thursday, and it's a Writing to Remember Obituary and Eulogy Writing Workshop with 4 writers from the Jackson Hole News and Guide. So that will finish up our series, and more info about that is on our website as well. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope this was valuable for everybody, and feel free to contact me. I gave you my phone number, my office phone number as well. So if you need any more information, anything else comes up, please feel free to contact me.